In the winter of 1925, in a small apartment in New York City, a woman in her 50s sat at a desk by lamplight, reading a letter of rejection. She had written a book. It was a slim thing, barely 100 pages, filled with ideas she had been teaching for years, in borrowed rooms and quiet parlors across Manhattan. Publisher after publisher had turned it away. The ideas were too strange, they said, too mystical, too far from the mood of a modern mechanical age. So she did something quietly remarkable. She gathered her savings, took the manuscript to a printer, and published the book herself. A century later, that little book has never once gone out of print. It has been translated into dozens of languages. It has passed from hand to hand, from mother to daughter, from stranger to stranger, carried in coat pockets and left on bedside tables, underlined and dog-eared, and read again in the small hours of difficult nights. Some of the most influential self-development writers of the 20th century would call it the book that started everything for them. The woman was Florence Scovel Shinn. The book was The Game of Life and How to Play It. And it begins with a single, unsettling proposition, that life is not a battle, as most of us have been taught to believe, but a game with rules. And that most of us lose, not because the game is rigged against us, but because nobody ever taught us how it is played. Which raises a question worth sitting with for a moment, here in the dark, as the day loosens its grip on you. What if some part of your life, some quiet, persistent pattern in it, has been shaped less by circumstance than by expectation? What if the words you say to yourself, the pictures you carry in your mind, the things you brace for, and the things you quietly assume you deserve, have been playing a larger part in your story than you ever suspected? Florence Scovel Shinn believed the answer was yes. Modern science, as we will see tonight, has a far more careful and complicated answer. And somewhere between her faith and our evidence lies one of the most interesting conversations of the last 100 years. Before we step into it, let me simply say welcome, and thank you for spending this night with me. Whether this is your first evening here, or you have drifted off to many of these journeys before, it means a great deal that you have chosen this channel as a place to rest. Some of you write to tell me where in the world you are listening from, and what you think of these stories as you fall asleep, and I read every one of those comments with real gratitude. So if something in tonight's journey stays with you, or if there is a subject you would love to drift away to in a future episode, do leave a thought below. This channel is built as much by you as by me. Now, settle yourself. Let the pillow take the full weight of your head. Let your shoulders sink. There is nothing you need to do for the rest of this night, except listen, and drift, and perhaps wonder. Because tonight we are traveling back 100 years, to a city of gaslight and ambition, to meet an artist who lost everything she had built her life upon, and who found, in that loss, an idea she believed could change the way a person lives. Whether she was right is a question we will hold gently, and honestly, all the way to the end. To understand Florence Scovel Shinn, you must first understand the world that made her, and the city in which her ideas took shape. Picture New York in the early years of the 20th century. Not the New York of glass towers, but an older, smokier city. Horse-drawn cabs still clatter over cobblestones, while the first motorcars weave impatiently between them. Elevated trains rumble above the avenues, showering sparks into the dusk. Gas lamps are giving way, street by street, to the strange, steady glow of electric light, and people stop on corners simply to look at it, this cold fire that burns without flame. It is a city drunk on the idea of transformation. Bridges are flung across rivers, buildings climb higher every year, as though the city itself believes that limits are merely suggestions. Immigrants arrive by the thousand, carrying everything they own, betting their entire lives on the proposition that a person can become something other than what they were born. And in the quieter corners of this roaring city, in church halls and hotel ballrooms and rented parlors with heavy curtains and hissing radiators, another kind of transformation is being discussed. In these rooms, people gather in the evenings to hear lecturers speak about the power of the mind. They belong to a loose, sprawling movement that historians now call New Thought. We will trace its roots properly a little later in our journey. For now, it is enough to know that by the time Florence arrived in New York, the city was full of these gatherings. Ordinary people, shopkeepers and seamstresses, bankers and widows, would finish their day's work, put on their good coat, and sit in rows of wooden chairs to hear that their thinking shaped their circumstances. That fear was a kind of prayer for what one did not want. That the mind, rightly used, could open doors which effort alone could not. It is easy, from our distance, to smile at those rooms. But pause for a moment and consider what those people were living through. Medicine could do little for most illness. There was no safety net to catch a family that fell. Life was precarious in ways we can barely imagine, and the official consolations on offer, stern religion on one side and cold materialism on the other, left many people hungry for something in between. Something that gave them, in their own small lives, a sense of agency. That hunger has never really gone away. It is why, a century later, we are still having this conversation. Feel free, as we walk these old streets together, to let your breathing slow. There is no hurry tonight. The city we are visiting has been asleep for 100 years, and it will wait for us. Somewhere in that city, in one of those lamplit rooms, a former illustrator with sharp eyes and a gentle wit is about to stand up and begin to teach. But to understand how she came to be standing there, we must go further back, across the river and down the years, to a brick house in Camden, New Jersey, where our story truly begins. Florence Scovel was born on the 24th of September, 1871, in Camden, New Jersey, just across the Delaware River from Philadelphia. Hers was a comfortable, respectable, quietly distinguished family. Her father, Alden Cortlandt Scovel, was a lawyer. The family tree reached back into early American history, with ancestors among the old colonial families of Pennsylvania and New Jersey. It was the kind of household where books mattered, where education was assumed, and where a certain standard of conduct was expected, without ever quite being discussed. America itself, in the year of her birth, was a country in convalescence. The Civil War had ended only 6 years earlier. The wounds of it were everywhere, in empty chairs at family tables, in the veterans on street corners, in the national mood, which swung between exhaustion and a fierce, almost desperate optimism. It was the beginning of the era Mark Twain would name the Gilded Age, a time of railways and fortunes, of invention and inequality, of enormous confidence resting on unsteady ground. Philadelphia, the city that dominated Florence's young horizon, was then one of the great workshops of the world. Its factories turned out locomotives and textiles and tools, but it was also a city of learning and art, of libraries and academies. And it offered something that mattered enormously for a girl of Florence's generation. It offered, just barely, the possibility that a woman might train seriously as an artist. We know less about Florence's childhood than we would like. She was not the kind of person who wrote memoirs, and the woman she became always pointed away from herself, towards her ideas. But we know the shape of the world she grew up in. A world of Sunday church-going and parlor pianos, of gas lamps lit at dusk, of long winters and coal fires, of children taught early that character was destiny. And we can notice something else, something that will matter later. Florence grew up in a culture saturated with words about words. The Protestant world of her childhood took it as given that speech had power, that a vow was binding, that a blessing or a curse was not mere air. Every Sunday she would have heard the cadences of the King James Bible, that vast library of stories in which the universe itself is spoken into being. Long before she ever encountered new thought, she had absorbed, in the marrow of her upbringing, the idea that the word is an instrument. Did you know that when Florence was born, the modern sciences of the mind simply did not exist? There was no psychology as an experimental discipline. Wilhelm Wundt would not open the first psychology laboratory in Leipzig until 1879, when Florence was 8 years old. William James would not publish his great Principles of Psychology until she was 19. The idea that the mind could be studied, measured, understood as a natural phenomenon was being born in the same decades she was growing up. Her life and the life of modern psychology run side by side, like two travelers on the same road who never quite meet, and part of tonight's journey is watching how close their paths come. For now, picture her simply as a girl in Camden, a girl with a talent for drawing, filling the margins of her schoolbooks with faces and figures, a girl watching the ferries cross the grey Delaware towards the spires and smoke of Philadelphia, where the art schools were. In 1889, at the age of 18, she crossed that river for good. She had won a place at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts, one of the oldest and most respected art schools in America. And it was there, among the easels and the plaster casts and the smell of turpentine, that her life truly began. The Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts, when Florence Scovel walked through its doors, was a place of high seriousness and quiet rebellion. The building itself was extraordinary, a Victorian Gothic palace of brick and stone on Broad Street. with soaring galleries and light falling from above onto marble floors. Students worked long days there, drawing from casts of ancient sculpture, then from life, learning anatomy with a rigor that bordered on the medical. The Academy had recently passed through the era of Thomas Eakins, the great, difficult realist painter who had insisted that art must be built on truth, on the actual structure of the actual world. His influence still hung in the air like the smell of oil paint. Florence flourished there. She studied at the Academy through the 1890s, and the surviving accounts describe a young woman of unusual charm, small and quick, with a gift for capturing character in a few strokes of the pen. Her talent ran towards illustration, towards the human and the humorous, faces and gestures and the small comedies of everyday life. And at the Academy, she met a young man named Everett Shinn. Everett was a few years younger than Florence, a dazzling, restless talent from Woodstown, New Jersey. He would go on to become one of the most celebrated artists of his generation, a member of the group of urban realist painters that critics later nicknamed the Ashcan School. Artists who turned away from pretty landscapes to paint the actual life of the American city, its theaters and tenements, its snowstorms and street corners, its glamour and its grime. They made, by every account, a striking pair. In 1898, Florence Scovel and Everett Shinn were married, and like so many ambitious young artists of their moment, they moved to New York. Their life there, in the early years of the new century, sounds almost impossibly romantic at this distance. They settled in the neighborhood around Waverly Place, in Greenwich Village, at the very moment the village was becoming the capital of artistic America. Their circle included painters and writers and actors. Everett painted the city and designed theatrical sets, and even built a small theater, where he staged comic melodramas of his own invention. Florence, witty and quick, acted in these productions, and those who saw her said she had real gifts on the stage. But she was never merely the artist's wife. Florence built a serious career of her own, in the golden age of American illustration. This was the era before photography dominated the printed page, when every magazine story and every novel came alive through the pen of an illustrator. Florence's drawings appeared in the leading. Divorce carried a real social shadow then. The comfortable identity she had inhabited, half of a celebrated artistic couple, was gone. The village world they had shared was full of mutual friends and awkward silences. She still had her illustration work, but the golden age of illustration itself was beginning to fade as photography advanced. Midlife, for her, arrived not as a gentle turning, but as a demolition. What does a person do when the life they built dissolves? Some grow bitter, some simply endure, and some, a few, go looking for a new way to understand what has happened to them, and in the search, become someone they could not otherwise have become. Florence was one of these. In the years after her divorce, she turned with growing seriousness to the spiritual movement whose lectures had been humming away in the background of New York life for decades. She began to study New Thought, first as a seeker, then as a student, and finally, by around the time of the First World War, as a teacher and practitioner in her own right. We do not know the single moment of her awakening, if there was one. What we know is the shape of the transformation. The successful illustrator gradually put down her pen and took up a new vocation, meeting with people in trouble, one by one and in small groups, and teaching them a way of thinking about their difficulties that she believed could change the difficulties themselves. There is something worth noticing in this, something her later critics sometimes miss. Florence's philosophy was not composed in comfort. It was forged by a woman who had lost her marriage, her social position, and her first career, in an age with little mercy for women in her position. When she wrote, years later, that no loss is final, that every failure carries the seed of a corresponding success, she was not repeating a slogan she had read somewhere. She was reporting, rightly or wrongly, on what she believed she had lived. Perhaps that is why her words landed differently than those of the polished lecturers in the grand ballrooms. People sensed that she had paid for her ideas. Let your body rest a little deeper now, as the story turns. The night is long and soft around you, and we have arrived at the moment where our artist becomes a teacher. But before we can understand what she taught, we need to understand the tradition she stepped into. So let us drift back a little further, to a clockmaker in Maine, and to the strange, fascinating river of ideas that flowed into that little book of 1925. Every book is written by more people than the name on its cover. Behind Florence Scovel Shinn stands a whole lineage of thinkers, and the story of that lineage is one of the stranger and more revealing chapters in American history. It begins, by most accounts, with a clockmaker. Phineas Parkhurst Quimby was born in New Hampshire in 1802 and spent most of his life in Maine. He was a practical man, a maker of mechanisms, with little formal education but a relentlessly curious mind. As a young man, he suffered from consumption, and the medicine of his day, with its mercury compounds and its bleeding, nearly finished what the disease had started. Then he noticed something odd. When he rode his horse at speed, absorbed and exhilarated, his symptoms eased. His recovery, however it truly happened, planted in him a conviction he would spend the rest of his life exploring. That belief itself plays a part in illness and in healing. Quimby became a healer, unorthodox and hugely popular. Patients traveled great distances to his rooms in Portland, Maine. His method, stripped of its period costume, was essentially conversation. He sat with sick people and talked with them, seeking, as he saw it, the mistaken belief at the root of their trouble, and replacing it with a truer, healthier one. He kept extensive notes, groping towards a theory that disease was, at least in part, a disturbance of the mind that expressed itself in the body. Now, from where we sit today, we can say two things at once about Quimby, and it is good practice for the whole of tonight's journey to hold them together. The first is that he was working before germ theory, before any real understanding of disease, and much of what he believed was simply wrong. The second is that he had stumbled onto something real, something medicine would take another century to study seriously: the measurable influence of expectation on symptoms, the phenomenon we now call the placebo response, along with its darker twin, the nocebo effect, in which fearful expectation makes things worse. Wrong in his explanations, Quimby was pointing, with a clockmaker's stubbornness, at a genuine gap in the understanding of his time. Among Quimby's patients was a chronically ill woman named Mary Baker Eddy, who would go on to found Christian Science, a movement related to, but distinct from our story. And in the decades after Quimby's death in 1866, his ideas spread outward through students and students of students, mixing along the way with two other great currents in the American mind. The first current was Transcendentalism, the philosophy of Ralph Waldo Emerson, which taught that a divine intelligence flows through nature and through every human soul, and that each person has direct access to it, without priest or intermediary. When New Thought writers spoke of infinite intelligence, as Florence constantly would, they were speaking Emerson's language. The second current came from further away, the first translations of Hindu and Buddhist texts arriving in America, with their ancient teaching that the mind shapes experience, that as a person thinks, so their world appears. Out of this confluence, in the last decades of the 19th century, New Thought was born. Not a church with a single founder, but a sprawling family of teachers, magazines, and congregations, united by a handful of core convictions that God, or infinite intelligence, is present in everyone, that thought is creative, that fear is the great enemy, and that health, prosperity, and peace are the natural state of a rightly ordered mind. One figure in this family matters especially for our story. Emma Curtis Hopkins, a formidable teacher based in Chicago, broke away from Mary Baker Eddy and founded her own seminary, training hundreds of students, most of them women, and sending them out across America. She became known as the teacher of teachers. Her students founded several of the movements that still exist today, and her influence reached, directly and indirectly, almost everyone in the New Thought world, including, by most accounts, the circles in which Florence Scovel Shinn studied in New York. Notice something remarkable here, something historians have often pointed out. New Thought was one of the very few movements of its era in which women held real authority. In the mainstream churches, women could not preach. In medicine and law, they were barely tolerated. But in New Thought, women founded churches, edited journals, wrote bestsellers, and stood on platforms teaching philosophy to mixed audiences. For a divorced woman artist in New York, this was not only a set of ideas, it was one of the only doors in her world that stood open. And what did the sober, scientific world make of all this? Here we meet one of the great figures of American thought, and one of the most interesting witnesses in our story. William James, the Harvard philosopher and founder of American psychology, studied the mind cure movement carefully. In his masterpiece of 1902, The Varieties of Religious Experience, he devoted serious attention to what he called the religion of healthy-mindedness. James did not endorse the movement's theology, but he refused to dismiss it because, as an empiricist, he was struck by a plain fact. For some people, in some conditions, it seemed to work. Lives changed. Symptoms eased. Habits broke. James thought that fact deserved study rather than scorn, And in his own writing on habit, attention, and the will to believe, he explored, in rigorous form, questions his mystical contemporaries were exploring in devotional form. Keep James in mind, resting there in the back of your thoughts, like a lamp in a far window. Of all the figures we will meet tonight, he stands closest to the balance we are seeking. Open-minded about human experience, honest about evidence, comfortable saying that a thing can be psychologically real and powerful even when its official explanation is mistaken. This, then, was the river of ideas flowing through New York when a newly divorced illustrator went looking for a way to rebuild her life. Emerson's divine spark, Quimby's healing conversations, Hopkins's trained women teachers, the first whispers of Eastern philosophy, all of it mingling in those lamplit lecture rooms. Florence stepped into that river, and then she did what genuine teachers always do. She made it her own. By the years of the First World War, Florence Scovel Shinn had become something New York had a name for, a metaphysical teacher and practitioner. The work looked like this. People came to her, singly or in small classes, with their troubles, money troubles mostly, and heart troubles, and health troubles, and that most common trouble of all, the sense of a life gone quietly wrong. She would listen. Then she would go to work on the way they were thinking and, above all, on the way they were speaking, giving them what she called statements of truth, precise affirmations fitted to their situation, like a key to a lock, and sending them out to act, in small concrete ways, as though the good they sought were already on its way. What set Florence apart from the other teachers of her city, by every surviving account, was her voice. Not the sound of it, but the character of it. The New Thought world tended towards the grand and the misty, towards long words and cosmic abstractions. Florence talked like a New Yorker. Her teaching was full of jokes, slang, and stories about actual people. The anxious salesman, the woman waiting for a lover who never called, the tenant fighting with her landlord. She had an illustrator's eye for the telling detail, and a comedian's sense of timing. Students remembered that being in her classes was, above all, fun, which was not a word anyone used about most metaphysical lectures. She taught for years before she wrote, and you can feel that in her books, which are less like treatises than like transcripts of a voice that has explained these things 1,000 times, in plain words, to tired people, and has learned exactly which stories make the ideas stick. By the early 1920s, her students were urging her to put the teaching on paper, so she did. Before we open the little book itself, stand for a moment in the year it was born, because 1925 was one of the strangest and most electric years in American history, and the book makes a different kind of sense once you can hear the decade humming around it. They called it the Jazz Age, and later, more ruefully, the era of wonderful nonsense. The war was over, the survivors wanted to live, and New York was the loudest room of the world's party. Skyscrapers were racing one another into the clouds. Radio, barely 4 years old as a public medium, was pouring voices into parlors that had never heard a stranger speak inside their walls. For the first time in human history, an idea could enter 1 million homes in a single evening. Fortunes were being made on paper, in a stock market climbing towards its terrible summit. That same year, a few blocks from Florence's classrooms, Scott Fitzgerald published The Great Gatsby, the story of a man who believed, with fatal purity, that a self could be invented by wanting hard enough. It sold poorly at the time. The decade was too busy living the plot to read it, and the decade was thinking about the mind as no decade had before. Freud's ideas had crossed the Atlantic and become dinner party conversation. Suddenly everyone in Manhattan knew they possessed an unconscious, a hidden basement self, with purposes of its own. However much the psychoanalysts and the New Thought teachers would have disliked one another, they were renovating the same house, teaching the same startled public that the visible mind is not the whole mind, that something beneath awareness is steering. But if you want the perfect emblem of the moment, consider a mild French pharmacist named Émile Coué, who arrived in America in 1923, to scenes we would now associate with celebrity. Coué taught a method he called conscious autosuggestion, boiled down to a single sentence his followers repeated, softly, 20 times at morning and 20 at night. Every day, in every way, I am getting better and better. Crowds mobbed his lectures. Newspapers ran the phrase as a running joke and a running miracle. Vaudeville comedians parodied it. Sick people swore by it. For a season or two, the entire English-speaking world was conducting an accidental experiment in affirmation. And then, as suddenly as it came, the craze passed, leaving behind a lesson Florence understood better than the crowds did. that a phrase chanted as a charm fades with the fashion, but a practice woven into a whole account of how a life works, with honesty and action and forgiveness stitched in, can hold people for decades. Coué offered a sentence. Florence, 2 years later, offered a game with rules. One is a curiosity of the 1920s, the other is still in print. Did you know, incidentally, that Coué himself insisted his method was not positive thinking at all, but a way of ending the war between will and imagination? When the two conflict, he taught, imagination always wins, which is why the insomniac who wills himself to sleep stays awake. It is one of those observations, half science and half showmanship, that modern researchers on effort and ironic process would read with a raised eyebrow and a slow nod. So this was the air of the city. In the winter, the little book went to the printers. Loud with radio and jazz and paper fortunes, giddy with self-invention, newly convinced that the mind had a basement, and briefly, half comically, chanting a French pharmacist's sentence into its bathroom mirrors. Into that roar, a 53-year-old former illustrator released 100 quiet pages that said, in effect, yes, the mind shapes the life, but not the way the loud men say, and not without honesty, and not without work. The roar, at first, took no notice at all. Let the noise of that vanished decade fade now, like a party heard from a warm bed several streets away. It is quiet again, and snow is in the air, and the story returns to a small desk and a manuscript and a stack of polite rejections. The manuscript she produced was short, direct, and unlike anything else on the shelves. She called it The Game of Life and How to Play It. The publishers of New York turned it down. We do not know exactly how many rejections there were, but the tradition passed down through her students is clear that there were several, and it is not hard to see why. The book was neither respectable religion nor respectable science. It was a small, strange, confident thing, written in plain speech, mixing Bible verses with anecdotes about rent money and hat shops. There was no obvious shelf to put it on. So in 1925, at the age of 53, Florence published it herself. Think of her for a moment. In that winter we imagined at the very beginning of tonight, arranging for the printing with her own savings, correcting proofs by lamplight, a woman past 50 backing her own strange little book against the judgment of an entire industry. Whatever one concludes about her philosophy, there is something quietly instructive in the fact that the book about faith was itself an act of faith. It found its readers the way such books always have, hand to hand. Students bought copies for troubled friends. Word spread through the New Thought networks, then beyond them. 3 years later, in 1928, she published a second book, Your Word is Your Wand, a collection of affirmations organized by need. In 1940 came the secret door to success. She died that same year, in October 1940, at the age of 69, teaching almost to the end. A final book, The Power of the Spoken Word, was assembled from her class notes by students and published after her death. She never saw what her first book became. Decade by decade, while grander books went out of print, the little self-published volume kept selling. Norman Vincent Peale, whose own book The Power of Positive Thinking would dominate the 1950s, praised her work warmly. The teachers who shaped the modern self-help world, from Louise Hay onward, would name her as an influence. A century on, the book sits in print in dozens of languages, still passed hand to hand, still read in the small hours. Why? What is actually in it? That is the heart of tonight's journey, and we will take it slowly, idea by idea, the way Florence herself would have taught it. So make yourself comfortable in the dark. Let the last tension of the day drain out of your hands. Imagine, if you like, that you have come in from a cold New York evening, that the radiator is hissing gently, that you have found a chair at the back of a small warm room, and that a small woman with bright eyes has just begun to speak. The book opens with its central image, and it is worth hearing in her own words. Most people, Florence wrote, consider life a battle, but it is not a battle, it is a game. Everything else in her philosophy unfolds from that single substitution. Consider what the metaphor of battle does to a life. A battle has enemies. A battle is won by force, by strain, by vigilance. In a battle, letting down your guard is how you get hurt. A person who deeply believes life is a battle will live tensed, braced, suspicious of ease, treating every setback as an attack and every stranger as a potential threat. A game is different. A game has rules, and rules can be learned. In a game, losing a round is information, not catastrophe. A game rewards skill and understanding rather than raw strain. And, perhaps most importantly, a game implies that the thing can be played well or badly, that outcomes are not simply handed down by fate, but shaped, at least in part, by how one plays. What were the rules as Florence saw them? The deepest one she stated in a sentence that has been quoted for 100 years. The game of life, she wrote, is a game of boomerangs, in which our thoughts, deeds and words, sooner or later return to us with astounding accuracy. What Florence believed, quite literally, was that this is a spiritual law, as real and impersonal as gravity. She grounded it in the biblical principle of sowing and reaping. Whatever a man sows, that shall he also reap. Give judgment, and judgment circles back to you. Give generosity, and generosity finds its way home. The universe, in her picture, is not a dead mechanism, but a vast mirror, faithfully reflecting back the essence of what each person puts out. Why did she believe it? Partly because her tradition taught it, from Emerson's law of compensation to the Eastern idea of karma that had newly arrived in American thought. But mostly, she said, because she had watched it. Decades of sitting with people in trouble had convinced her that the resentful reliably found new things to resent, that the fearful met their fears with uncanny regularity, and that people who genuinely changed their inner posture found their outer circumstances changing in ways that seemed, to her, beyond coincidence. Now let us do what we promised at the start of the night, and set beside her belief what a careful modern observer might say. Science knows of no cosmic boomerang. There is no evidence for a physical law returning our thoughts to us, and 100 years of research gives us good reason to be suspicious of the patterns Florence saw, because the human mind is a relentless pattern finder. We remember hits and forget misses. This is confirmation bias, one of the most robust findings in psychology, and any honest account of her philosophy must keep it constantly in view. And yet, some psychologists would add, the boomerang image is not empty. It describes, in mythic language, something quite real about social and psychological life. A person's habitual attitude genuinely does return to them, through entirely ordinary channels. The chronically hostile person subtly provokes hostility, then experiences a hostile world. The trusting, warm person elicits warmth and lives, statistically speaking, in a friendlier universe. Sociologist Robert K. Merton gave this loop its modern name in 1948, the self-fulfilling prophecy, a false or arbitrary expectation that evokes the very behavior that makes it come true. What Florence called a spiritual law, Merton described as a social mechanism. The vocabulary could hardly be more different. The observed loop is strikingly similar. Perhaps then, the fairest way to hold her central idea is this. As metaphysics, it is unproven and unprovable. As a description of how character tends to construct circumstance, slowly, through 10,000 small interactions, it contains a truth that psychology has spent a century mapping in careful detail. Florence had one more thing to say about the game, and it may be her most quoted line of all. "No man is your enemy," she taught. "No man is your friend. Every man is your teacher." Whatever arrives in the game, especially what arrives painfully, is to be studied rather than merely suffered, asked what it has come to show you about your own patterns of thought. A modern therapist would want to add careful boundaries to that idea, and later tonight, when we weigh the criticisms, we will. But notice, for now, how closely it rhymes with the ancient Stoics, with Marcus Aurelius writing in his private notebook that the impediment to action advances action, that what stands in the way becomes the way. 2,000 years apart, the Roman emperor and the New York illustrator arrived at the same posture towards difficulty, not denial, not despair, but curiosity. Rest with that image a moment, a long corridor of teachers, stretching back through the centuries, each holding a lamp, and somewhere far down the corridor, a door is opening onto the next of Florence's great themes, the one she considered the engine of the whole game, expectation. If you remember only one idea from tonight, let it be this one, because it is the load-bearing wall of Florence's entire philosophy, and it is also the point where her thought comes closest to modern science. Florence taught that we do not receive what we want, we receive what we expect. The distinction sounds small. It is everything. Wanting, in her observation, is often shot through with the feeling of lack, with a quiet background certainty that the wanted thing will not come. A person can want prosperity while expecting struggle, want love while expecting abandonment, want health while expecting decline. And in her teaching, it is the expectation, the deep settled picture of what is coming, that steers the life, because it is the expectation that governs how a person speaks, decides, notices, and acts. Faith, in her vocabulary, is simply expectation turned towards the good. She defined it with a phrase borrowed from Scripture: the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. And fear, in one of her most striking formulations, is not the opposite of faith, but a form of it. Fear, she said, is only inverted faith, faith in evil instead of good. The fearful person is not lacking in belief. They believe intensely, vividly, with their whole body. They have simply placed their belief in disaster. Why did she believe expectation had such power? Her explanation was theological. The subconscious mind, she taught, is a power without direction of its own, which faithfully carries out whatever is impressed upon it, and infinite intelligence works through it. Impress fear upon it, and it builds fear's picture. Impress faith, and it builds faith's picture. Set the theology gently to one side now, and look at what a century of research has found, because this is one of the places where the conversation between 1925 and today becomes genuinely fascinating. Current science indicates that expectation is among the most powerful variables ever studied in psychology and medicine. The placebo response is the most famous example. Give a person an inert tablet with the confident expectation of relief, and, for certain conditions, pain, nausea, some forms of depression and anxiety, measurable relief often follows, accompanied by real changes in the brain, including, in the case of pain, the release of the body's own opioids. The effect has limits that matter enormously. Placebo expectation does not shrink tumors or cure infections, and no honest researcher claims it does. But within its domain, the effect is so reliable that every serious drug trial on Earth must be designed around it. Expectation, in other words, is not nothing. It is a force so real that medicine measures everything else against it. Its shadow is just as real. Nocebo effects, in which negative expectation produces genuine symptoms, are well documented. Patients warned of side effects feel them at higher rates, even on sugar pills. When Florence wrote that fear attracts the thing feared, she was speaking mythically. But a physician today, reading the nocebo literature, might allow that she had glimpsed something true about the body's obedience to dark expectation. Then there is the social side. In 1968, psychologists Robert Rosenthal and Lenore Jacobson ran one of the most famous experiments of the century. Teachers were told that certain pupils, actually chosen at random, were poised for an intellectual growth spurt. Months later, those randomly chosen children showed measurably greater gains. The teacher's expectations had leaked out through 1,000 tiny channels. More warmth, more patience, richer questions, and the children had risen towards the picture held of them. The finding, named the Pygmalion effect, has been debated, refined, and qualified in the decades since, and the true effect sizes appear more modest than the legend suggests. But the core phenomenon, that expectation transmits itself and shapes performance, has survived scrutiny. And expectation shapes the expector most of all. Psychologist Albert Bandura spent a career demonstrating that self-efficacy, a person's belief in their own capacity to act effectively, is one of the strongest predictors of persistence, resilience, and achievement, not because belief is magic, but because people who expect their efforts to matter make more attempts, endure more setbacks, and therefore, on average, harvest more successes. Carol Dweck's research on mindset points the same direction. Those who expect ability to be expandable behave differently in the face of failure than those who expect it to be fixed, and the difference compounds over years. None of this proves Florence's metaphysics. All of it suggests why her teaching seemed to work often enough to keep her rooms full. She was, in effect, running a practice devoted to the systematic reconstruction of expectation, in an age when nobody else was offering such a thing. How might a person today use this, without swallowing anything unproven? Gently and honestly. It might mean noticing, in some corner of life, what you actually expect, as opposed to what you say you want. Catching the difference between hoping an interview goes well and quietly rehearsing its failure. It might mean, before a difficult conversation, spending a moment picturing it going ordinarily well, rather than catastrophically badly. Not because the universe is listening, but because your own nervous system is. Expectation, the research suggests, is not destiny, but it is a lens, and lenses can be cleaned. Somewhere outside your window, the night is deepening. Let it. There is nothing you need to hold on to. Even these ideas will keep drifting alongside you if you sleep, like slow barges on a dark river. Because we are coming now to the idea Florence was most famous for in her own lifetime, the one that gave her second book its title. The strange, ancient, and newly scientific question of what our words do to us. Of all the instruments in Florence's toolbox, none mattered more to her than speech. Your word, she told her students, is your wand. What Florence believed was ancient and literal. She stood in the long tradition that regards the word as creative, the tradition of a scripture that opens with a universe spoken into existence, of blessings and vows, and the commandment against careless oaths. The spoken word in her teaching is thought made flesh, the point at which an invisible attitude commits itself to the world. Every time we speak about our lives, she taught, we are issuing instructions to the subconscious, and the subconscious, that faithful, humorless servant, takes everything literally and sets about building it. This is why she was severe, in her cheerful way, about the casual speech of everyday life. The person who says, all day and every day, that they are always broke by the 20th of the month, that nothing ever works out for them, that their back is killing them, that they would forget their own head, is, in her picture, dictating a blueprint. She urged her students to become, first, simply aware of how they talked about themselves, and most of them, she reported, were astonished at what they heard once they began to listen. How did she illustrate it? With stories, always. A woman in her classes had spoken for years, half-jokingly, about the poverty she was surely headed for, furnishing the picture in detail, and Florence traced the woman's dwindling fortunes to the slow hammering of that talk. Another student was taught to stop describing herself as unlucky, to cease rehearsing aloud the story of a life where doors always closed, and, in the retelling, the doors began to open. We cannot verify these anecdotes, and honesty requires us to say so plainly. They are teaching stories, selected by a teacher, subject to every bias we have discussed. But they show us exactly how the method worked in the room. And on the constructive side stood the affirmation, the tool Florence refined more carefully than perhaps any teacher of her generation. Her affirmations were not vague pep talk, they were precise, rhythmic, and always phrased in the present or the perfect tense, statements not of pleading, but of settled fact, that the divine plan of her student's life now unfolded, that every door now opened for perfect self-expression. She had a poet's ear for cadence, and her students noticed that her statements were easy to remember and oddly pleasant to say, which was not an accident. She was, after all, a professional maker of images, and she built her sentences the way she had once built illustrations, for vividness and for staying power. Now let us open the modern ledger, because the science of self-directed speech is richer and stranger than either the believers or the skeptics tend to admit. On one side, there is real evidence that words aimed at oneself matter. Psychologists studying self-talk in athletes have found consistent, if modest, performance benefits from deliberate instructional and motivational self-speech. Research on what is called distanced self-talk, coaching yourself by name or as you rather than I, suggests it measurably cools emotional reactivity, as though a few centimeters of grammatical distance were enough to loosen a feeling's grip. Cognitive behavioral therapy, one of the best validated treatments in the history of psychology, rests on a premise Florence would have recognized instantly, that the habitual sentences running through a mind shape mood and behavior, and that changing the sentences, deliberately, repeatedly, changes the person. And work on self-affirmation theory has found that affirming one's core values before a threat, an exam, a difficult negotiation, a health warning, reliably reduces defensiveness and improves openness, with imaging studies showing engagement of the brain's valuation systems as people affirm what matters to them. On the other side stands a famous cautionary study. In 2009, psychologist Joanne Wood and colleagues tested the classic positive affirmation, the simple repetition of a statement like, "I am a lovable person," and found something Florence's cheerier airs rarely mention. For people with low self-esteem, the very people most drawn to such statements, repeating them made mood worse, not better. The proposed explanation is elegant and important. A statement that collides too violently with what a person actually believes does not overwrite the belief. It provokes it. The mind rises up with counter-evidence, and the affirmation becomes a trigger for an inner argument that the affirmation loses. Interestingly, Florence's own practice anticipated some of this. She taught that an affirmation must not arouse the mind's opposition, that it should carry a feeling of naturalness and relief. and she often built her statements around openness rather than grandiosity, around doors opening and ways being made, rather than flat declarations of qualities her students plainly did not feel they had. Some modern practitioners would say she had discovered, by trial and error in those lamplit rooms, roughly where the psychological limits of the tool lay. So where does that leave a listener today, lying comfortably in the dark? Perhaps here, the strong claim that words command reality remains a belief, not a finding. The moderate claim that words shape the speaker, their mood, their attention, their persistence, and through the speaker, slowly, their circumstances, is supported from a dozen directions. You are, at minimum, the one person who hears everything you say. It seems reasonable to speak to that person with some care. Breathe out, slowly, and let the weight of the day go with it. Somewhere in our imagined city, snow has begun to fall past the street lamps, softening every sound, and Florence is turning, as she always did, from the word to its older sibling, the image. Before she was a teacher, remember, Florence was an illustrator. For decades, her livelihood was the knowledge that a picture reaches people in a way a paragraph cannot. When she came to build her philosophy, that knowledge moved to its center. The imagination, she taught, is the creative faculty itself. She liked to say that a person will eventually manifest what they picture with feeling and persistence, and she called the imagining faculty the scissors of the mind, cutting the patterns that a life then wears. In her reading of scripture, the ancient warning that where there is no vision the people perish was not poetry, but engineering. Without a sustained inner picture of the good, a life drifts and frays. She was careful, in her way, about how the tool should be used, and here we meet one of the ideas her tradition is most misunderstood on. Florence did not teach idle daydreaming. Her instruction was always twinned with action. She told her students to prepare, physically and practically, for the thing they had imagined and affirmed, to show what she called active faith. The woman praying for the right home was sent out to look at houses. The man affirming employment was expected to polish his shoes and knock on doors. Digging ditches before rain, she called it, borrowing an image from the prophets. Faith without works, in her repeated phrase, was dead, and imagination without preparation was merely a pleasant way of standing still. Hold that beside the modern research, because the fit and the friction are instructive. That mental imagery as powerful is no longer in dispute. Neuroscience has shown that vividly imagining a movement activates much of the same neural machinery as performing it, which is why motor imagery is now a standard evidence-based tool in elite sport and in stroke rehabilitation. In one much-discussed line of research, participants who merely imagined strength training, session after session, showed real, measurable strength gains, more modest than those who actually trained, but far from zero, apparently through changes in the neural drive to muscle. Visualization, used in this precise sense, mentally rehearsing a process, is about as close to accepted science as anything in tonight's story. But the same literature contains a sharp warning, and it lands exactly where Florence's less careful heirs are weakest. The psychologist Gabriele Oettingen has spent decades studying positive fantasy, the enjoyment of imagining the desired outcome itself, the achieved goal, the finished triumph. Her repeated finding is that indulging in outcome fantasy on its own tends to reduce the energy people bring to pursuit and to predict poorer results, as though the mind, having feasted on the imagined success, feels less hunger to earn the real one. Her evidence-based alternative, mental contrasting, pairs the vivid picture of the goal with an equally vivid picture of the obstacles in the way, and in study after study, this pairing outperforms fantasy alone. Notice what this does to the popular manifestation culture of our own day, and notice too that it is gentler on Florence herself than one might expect. The instruction to picture the end result and bask in its feeling, full stop, is precisely the pattern Oettingen's research warns against. But Florence's actual method, image plus preparation, vision plus shoe leather, faith shown by digging ditches, sits far closer to mental contrasting than to modern vision board culture. She would not have been surprised, one suspects, to learn that imagining the trophy is idle while rehearsing the training works. She had watched the difference for 30 years. Perhaps that is the quiet lesson of this whole chapter of her thought. The imagination is real machinery, not magic. Like all machinery, it does specific things. It rehearses, it primes attention, it steadies motivation around a chosen picture. Ask it to do those things, and the evidence is warmly on your side. Ask it to replace the work, and both the prophetess and the professor will tell you the same thing. The fire in our imagined room has burned low now, down to a bed of amber. Feel how heavy your limbs have become, how little the world is asking of you tonight. Let it stay that way. There are only a few more rooms in this old house of ideas, and we can wander them slowly. The next one is the strangest, and the most personal. Florence called it the divine design. Deep in the game of life sits an idea that separates Florence from the cruder prosperity teachers who came before and after her, and it is the idea her students seem to love most. There is for each person, she taught, a divine design, a right place, a pattern of life that fits them as no other pattern does, containing the health, the wealth, the love, and the self-expression that are genuinely theirs. Most unhappiness, in her diagnosis, comes not from failing to get what we chase, but from chasing things that were never ours to begin with, lives copied from parents, from envy, from fear. And so her most famous affirmation asked not for any specific prize, but for the design itself to appear, for infinite intelligence to open the way, and for the right thing, the thing intended, to arrive by grace, in a perfect way. What she believed, plainly stated, was that a divine intelligence holds a plan for each life, and can be trusted with the details. Why she believed it is written across her biography. She was a woman whose own carefully built plan, the marriage, the studio, the Golden Village life, had been demolished, and who found on the far side of the demolition a vocation she could never have designed, one that fitted her, by every account, far better than the first life had. She taught what she felt she had lived, that the loss of the wrong thing is the beginning of the right one. Alongside the design, she placed its messenger, intuition. Intuition, she wrote, is a spiritual faculty which does not explain, but simply points the way. She trained her students to ask for leads and hunches, and to follow them, especially the small, unreasonable ones, the impulse to take a different street, to write to a forgotten friend, to say yes to the odd invitation. Reason, she liked to say, plans anxiously. Intuition simply knows the next step. Now, the modern ledger, honestly kept, must be more divided here than anywhere else tonight. On purpose, the evidence is warm. A large body of research in psychology associates a sense of meaning and purpose with better mood, better health behaviors, greater resilience, and even, in long-running cohort studies, longevity. Viktor Frankl, the psychiatrist who survived the Nazi camps, built his whole school of therapy on the observation that human beings can endure almost anyhow if they have a why, and that the loss of felt meaning is itself a kind of illness. Self-determination theory, one of the most tested frameworks in motivation science, finds that goals aligned with a person's authentic values and interests, what researchers call self-concordant goals, are pursued with more energy and deliver more well-being than goals adopted for approval or fear. Strip the theology from the divine design, and something very like this remains. The observation that lives built around borrowed goals goes subtly wrong, and that there is, for each person, work and love that fits. On intuition, science asks for more caution. The research, associated with Daniel Kahneman and Gary Klein among others, suggests that intuition is real, but conditional. It is pattern recognition, and it becomes trustworthy only in environments regular enough to learn, with enough repetition and feedback. The firefighters feel for a burning building. The nurses sense that a patient is about to decline. In irregular, noisy domains, picking stocks, judging strangers, predicting the future, confident hunches are often just noise wearing a badge. And no evidence supports the idea that hunches are messages from beyond. A fair modern translation of Florence's practice might be this. She trained people to consult their accumulated, unarticulated knowledge instead of only their anxious reasoning. And for many decisions, that is genuinely wise counsel, provided one remembers that a hunch is a hypothesis, not an oracle. And on the theology itself, on whether there is a design and a designer, science is simply silent, as it must be. That is a question each listener carries privately, and tonight makes no claim upon it. But perhaps before we drift onward, it is worth noticing what the idea did for the people in those rooms, whatever its ultimate truth. It gave anxious strivers permission to stop forcing. It reframed rejection. The door that closed was not a verdict on their worth, but a redirection. Nothing in your life is lost, Florence taught. If it is truly yours, what is yours cannot finally miss you. As metaphysics, unprovable. As a posture for enduring uncertainty, you can see why tired people slept better for believing it. Let that thought rest beside you on the pillow, asking nothing of you. The snow is still falling in our city of lamps. And there is a small room off this one, easy to miss, that we should look into before the harder lessons come, because it holds the most misunderstood word in her whole vocabulary. The word is prayer, and Florence used it constantly, and almost no one today hears it the way she meant it. Prayer, in the common picture, is petition. It is asking, and asking implies distance, doubt, a favor that may be refused. The beggar's posture is built into the grammar. Florence taught something close to the opposite. True prayer, in her practice, was not begging but praise and thanksgiving, the act of giving thanks for the good before any sign of it had appeared. Her students were taught to stop pleading for the position, the healing, the reconciliation, and instead to give thanks that the right outcome was already prepared and already on its way. Before they were to say thank you. To modern ears, this can sound like self-deception, and the objection deserves a straight answer. What Florence believed was theological, that supply exists before demand in the divine order, and thanksgiving is simply accurate accounting done early. What a psychologist might notice is different and subtler. The move from pleading to thanksgiving is a move from the emotional register of lack to the emotional register of sufficiency, and everything we have heard tonight about expectation, attention, and the nervous system suggests those registers are not interchangeable. The person who begs rehearses the absence. The person who gives thanks rehearses the presence. And rehearsal, as the centuries' research kept finding, is never neutral. One does not need her cosmology to notice that the two postures produce different people by morning. There was a discipline hidden in this teaching, and it was sterner than it sounds. To give thanks in advance, a person must first stop narrating the emergency, and Florence's students found that the hardest instruction of all. She would interrupt their recitals of trouble, gently, wickedly, and ask them what they were thankful for, and they would sit in offended silence, and then, slowly, begin to count. It was the same medicine the gratitude laboratories would bottle 70 years later, attention forcibly redirected from the missing to the given. The theology of it may be taken or left. The redirection itself is one of the most replicated interventions in the whole of positive psychology, with its measured gains in mood, in optimism, and, fittingly for this hour, in the depth and ease of sleep. She attached one more instruction to prayer, and it completes the picture of her method. Having asked rightly and given thanks, her student was to stop discussing the matter. Not with friends, not with family, not with the inner committee that convenes at 3 in the morning. Talking a hope to pieces, she had observed, scatters it. Every anxious conversation about the thing reopens the case and hands the verdict back to fear. Keep it, she said, like a seed in the dark. And here, once more, the old teacher and the modern researcher find themselves oddly close. For studies on announcing intentions suggest that broadcasting a goal can bleed off the very tension that drives its pursuit, and every clinician knows the difference between processing a worry and marinating in it. A seed in the dark. It is, when you think about it, precisely what you are at this moment, something quietly becoming, in the warm black soil of the night, with no need to discuss it. So her prayer, taken whole, was a strange and rather beautiful machine. Ask once, in the settled expectation of good, give thanks early, act as if, and then hold the silence, and let the season turn. Whether anything beyond the nervous system was listening is the question tonight has promised not to answer. That the nervous system itself was listening seems, by now, beyond much doubt. And with that, the side room is seen, and the lamp can be carried onward. Florence has 2 more lessons to teach before the class is dismissed, and they are the 2 her modern readers find hardest: letting go and forgiving. There is a scene that recurs throughout Florence's books, in a dozen variations. A student has done everything the teaching asks. They have cleaned up their speech, held the picture, dug the ditches, and nothing has happened. They arrive at her door, wound tight as a watch spring, gripping their desire so hard their knuckles have gone white. And Florence, again and again, gives them the same strange prescription: let go of it. Non-resistance was, for her, close to the deepest law of all. What you resist, she taught, persists. What you fight, you feed. And nothing on earth can withstand an absolutely non-resistant person. She loved the image of water, which never struggles with the rock in its path, and wears it away all the same. Anxious desire, in her diagnosis, carries its own defeat inside it, because clutching is a form of fear, and fear, as we have heard, is faith in the wrong outcome. So she taught her students a rhythm that sounds paradoxical until you have watched anyone try to fall. Asleep, work, picture, speak, prepare, and then release. Cast the burden, in her constant phrase, and walk away lightly, letting the matter ripen out of sight. Every contemplative tradition on earth has a version of this teaching, from the Taoist Wu Wei to the Stoic reminder that outcomes were never ours to command, only efforts. And modern psychology, without any metaphysics at all, keeps rediscovering the same shape. Researchers studying ironic process theory have shown that the direct suppression of a thought reliably increases its frequency, the famous experiment being the simple instruction not to think of a white bear. Sleep science offers the cleanest everyday example. The harder a person strains to fall asleep, monitoring their own wakefulness with mounting alarm, the more sleep recedes, which is why modern insomnia treatment often begins by dismantling the effort itself. Performance psychology tells the same story from the sports field, where clutching, wanting it too much in the final set, measurably degrades the fluent skill that relaxed practice built. Acceptance and commitment therapy, one of the best studied of the newer clinical approaches, is built almost entirely on the finding that struggling against inner experience amplifies it, while acceptance, oddly, loosens its grip. None of this means the universe rewards detachment. It means the nervous system does. Florence, watching her wound-up students, had noticed a real dial on the human machine, even if her wiring diagram of the cosmos was her own. And then, the harder teaching still, forgiveness. Florence placed forgiveness near the center of her system, and she meant something more radical than good manners. Resentment in her teaching was the most corrosive force a person could harbor, a poison the bearer drinks, and she went so far as to link chronic bitterness with the decay of health and fortune alike. To hold hatred, she taught, is to remain chained to the person hated, replaying the injury on an endless loop, casting them as the permanent author of one's life. Forgiveness in her practice was not approval of the wrong and not reconciliation with the wrongdoer. It was the cutting of the chain. She had her students bless those who had injured them, actually speak good over the names that made their jaws tighten, not for the offender's sake, but for their own release. Here she has been widely misunderstood, so let us say it carefully, in the quiet. Forgiveness, in this teaching, is not weakness, not amnesia, and not an obligation to trust again. A person can forgive an injury and still lock the door. What is released is the rumination, the inner courtroom that has been in session for years, at the sole expense of the judge. And on this point, unusually, modern research is almost unreservedly on her side. Decades of studies on forgiveness interventions, including the structured programs developed by psychologists such as Everett Worthington and Robert Enright, associate the practice of forgiveness with lower anxiety and depression, reduced hostility, better cardiovascular markers, and improved sleep, while chronic hostility and rumination show the reverse pattern. The mechanism proposed is not mystical. Sustained resentment is a stress response that never switches off, and the body pays for it in the currency of cortisol and blood pressure. When Florence told her students that their bitterness was harming no one but themselves, she was moralizing. She also appears, by current evidence, to have been broadly right. Feel how much softer the night has become while we talked of letting go. That is fitting. Of all her teachings, this is the one you can practice without believing a single word of her theology. Right now, by simply unclenching whatever your mind has been holding and letting the mattress do the work of carrying you. We have walked through the heart of the philosophy now. The game, the boomerang, expectation, the word, the image, the design, the release, the forgiveness. Before we carry it all into our own century's laboratories, and then into the honest courtroom of its critics, let us do one more thing that Florence herself, a great borrower and comparer, would have enjoyed. Let us seat her, for a little while, at a long table of thinkers, some of whom she read, some of whom read her, and some of whom never heard her name at all, and listen to what they might have said to one another. Every idea has ancestors, and the pleasure of intellectual history is watching the family resemblances appear across impossible distances of time. Seat the Stoics at one end of the table, in the lamplight. Epictetus, the freed slave who taught in the 1st century that we are disturbed not by events but by our judgments about events. And Marcus Aurelius, the emperor writing to himself by candlelight on the Danube frontier, that the soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts. Florence never claimed them, and her sunny American cosmos is far from their granite endurance. Yet listen to the rhyme. Both traditions locate the decisive battle of a life inside the mind. Both treat adversity as curriculum. Both prescribe the daily tending of one's inner speech. Where they part is instructive. The Stoic tends his thoughts expecting nothing from fortune, seeking only virtue and calm, while Florence tended thoughts expecting everything from fortune, believing the outer world would answer. A Stoic would call that a dangerous promise. Florence would call the Stoic's peace a beautiful house with the front door never opened. Between them lies a genuine philosophical choice that every reader of self-help still makes, usually without noticing. Closer to her own branch of the family sits Ralph Waldo Emerson, whom the whole New Thought movement claimed as a grandfather. His essays on self-reliance and compensation supplied the movement's deepest assumptions, that a divine current runs through each person, that the universe keeps faithful books, that conformity is a kind of sleep. Beside him, his friend Thoreau, who went to the woods to live deliberately and reported that a person advancing confidently towards their dreams meets with a success unexpected in common hours, a sentence that could sit unnoticed in any of Florence's chapters. She inherited their confidence. What she added was something neither Concord sage possessed, a practice. Emerson gives you a magnificent view, Florence gives you homework. Then the English clerk. In 1903, a quiet Victorian named James Allen published a meditation called As a Man Thinketh, teaching that mind is the master weaver of circumstance, that a person's outer life is their inner life made visible. It is the same doctrine as Florence's, in graver clothes, and the two little books have traveled the century side by side. The difference is temperament. Allen is a moralist, solemn as a Sunday, cause and effect in his garden, grind with perfect justice. Florence is a humorist, and her universe, though lawful, is kind, full of last-minute rescues, and doors opening at the 11th hour. Readers tend to need both books at different hours of their lives. 2 decades after her, the salesmen arrive at the table. Napoleon Hill, whose Think and Grow Rich appeared in 1937, 3 years before Florence's death, interviewed the industrialists of his age and distilled a gospel of burning desire, definite purpose, and auto-suggestion. Much of his machinery, the affirmations, the faith, the subconscious as servant, is recognizably the same equipment, tuned for acquisition. What thins in Hill is precisely what is thickest in Florence, the ethics. Her law returns whatever you send, so kindness is not decoration but strategy. Her design forbids trampling, since what is yours cannot be taken, and what is another's cannot be kept. Hill's readers were taught to want harder, hers were taught first to want rightly. It is the difference, one might say, between a book about getting and a book about receiving, and then, from the far side of the scientific divide, 2 unlikely interlocutors. Carl Jung, who never, so far as we know, read her, but whose consulting room in Zurich was filled with the same discovery, that the psyche runs on images more than arguments, that what remains unconscious returns to us from outside, as he put it, looking like fate. When Jung wrote that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it destiny, he was giving a depth psychologist's translation of Florence's Boomerang, and the resemblance is close enough that readers of one often stumble, surprised, into the other. And Viktor Frankl, who tested in the camps what no doctrine should ever have to test, and who emerged insisting on the last of the human freedoms, the choosing of one's attitude in any given set of circumstances. Frankl is the corrective the whole optimistic tradition needs, and rarely accepts. Proof that the inner stance matters absolutely, joined to proof that circumstance can be monstrous beyond any thought's control. He keeps the truth in Florence's teaching, while burning away its innocence. One could extend the table indefinitely. William James we have already seated, with his lamp of fair-minded curiosity. Carol Dweck and Albert Bandura sit at the modern end, measuring with instruments what the older guests asserted with scripture. Somewhere down the far side, the contemporary popularizers, the dispensers, and the manifestation influencers talk excitedly, and a little too loudly, mixing genuine neuroscience of habit and attention with quantum vocabulary it does not support. And the scientists at the table wince, and Florence, one suspects, watching them sell certainty where she taught practice, might wince too. But the point of the long table is not to rank the guests, it is to notice what they are all, in their wildly different dialects, talking about: the strange, ancient, still unfinished question of how much of a life flows from the inside out. No century has answered it. Every century has needed to ask. The candles on that long table are guttering now, one by one, and the guests are fading back into their centuries, and you are sinking a little deeper into your own warm dark. What remains is to step back into our own laboratories and ask the two questions we have been saving. What does modern science, taken all together, make of this woman? And what should an honest person hold against her? Before the criticisms, one more visit to the laboratory, because there is a cluster of modern findings that, taken together, explain better than anything else why Florence's methods so often seem to work, and why her followers so often overclaim. Begin with attention. The brain is drowning in information at every moment, millions of signals arriving from the senses, and it survives by filtering, promoting to consciousness only what seems relevant to current goals and expectations. Popular self-help books like to attribute this to the reticular activating system, and you may have heard the claim that this brainstem network explains why, after you decide to buy a certain car, you suddenly see it everywhere. The honest version is more modest. The reticular formation is mainly a regulator of arousal and wakefulness, and the everyday phenomenon is better described as the frequency illusion, the combined work of selective attention and confirmation bias. But the phenomenon itself is perfectly real. What you hold as important, you begin to notice. The person steeped in thoughts of opportunity and the person steeped in thoughts of grievance are, quite literally, shown different worlds by their own filters, each finding endless evidence for their expectation. Now deepen that picture with one of the most influential frameworks in contemporary neuroscience, predictive processing. On this account, associated with theorists such as Carl Friston and Andy Clark, and extended into emotion by Lisa Feldman Barrett, the brain is not a passive receiver of reality, but a prediction engine, constantly generating a model of what is about to happen and correcting it against the senses. Much of what you perceive moment to moment is your brain's forecast, lightly edited by incoming evidence. Barrett's work suggests that even emotions are, in part, constructed predictions, the brain's best guess about what this pounding heart, in this context, means. The implications are still being worked out, and the framework has its scientific critics. But if anything like it is true, then expectation is not one influence on experience among many. It is half the fabric of experience itself. 100 years ago, a woman with no laboratory wrote that we see the world through the mold of our beliefs, and that changing the deep expectation changes what appears. She had the mechanism entirely wrong, and the emphasis, current neuroscience indicates, surprisingly right. Add neuroplasticity, the discovery that the adult brain physically remodels itself with use, famously visible in the enlarged spatial memory structures of London taxi drivers. What is practiced strengthens, including patterns of thought, a repeated affirmation, a rehearsed image, a daily gratitude. These are, at minimum, repetitions, and the brain keeps score of repetitions. Add habit science, from William James's Victorian chapter on habit to the modern work of researchers like Wendy Wood, showing that roughly 40% of daily behavior runs on automated cues rather than decisions, and that lasting change comes less from willpower than from redesigning the cues and repeating the new response until it hardens. On average, in one well-known study, that hardening took most of 10 weeks, which is almost comically close to the old traditions of 40-day disciplines and daily treatments that teachers like Florence prescribed. And add, finally, the sleeping brain, since you are so near it now. Matthew Walker and other sleep researchers have shown that sleep is when the day's learning is consolidated, when the brain replays and files and strengthens what was rehearsed while awake, and when emotional experience is gently stripped of its charge. The old habit of tending one's thoughts at bedtime, of ending the day with a settled, chosen picture rather than a churn of grievance, looks less quaint in that light. Whatever is in the mind at this hour is, in a modest and entirely physical sense, handed to the night shift. There, then, is the sober case for why her rooms stayed full. Expectation steers perception, prediction shapes experience, attention filters evidence, repetition rewires tissue, action compounds, and sleep consolidates the whole. No cosmic boomerang required. A person who spent months in Florence's classes was, in modern terms, running a daily program of attention training, cognitive reframing, behavioral activation, and expectation repair. So it would be strange if nothing happened. Before honesty demands its full hour, let the century itself tell a few of its stories, because the strangest evidence for the power of expectation was never gathered in Florence's parlors at all. It was gathered, decades after her death, by people in white coats and running shoes who had never heard her name. Consider first a surgeon in Houston near the end of the 20th century with a heresy on his conscience. Bruce Moseley was an orthopedic specialist who performed arthroscopic surgery on arthritic knees, a common operation, and he had begun to wonder how much of its benefit came from the scalpel and how much from the theater of healing itself. So he ran a trial that still startles medical students. Some patients received the real operation. Others received anesthesia, 3 small ceremonial incisions, and nothing more. A performance of surgery, with the surgeon following a script. 2 years later, the placebo patients had improved as much as the surgical ones, walking better, hurting less, some of them gratefully recommending the operation they had never actually had. The study, published in 2001, did not show that knees obey thoughts. It showed that the ritual of confident treatment, the expectation of repair, can produce real, lasting, measurable relief in a painful joint. Florence, who filled her books with healings she attributed to the spoken word, would have drawn her conclusion. Medicine drew a more careful one and changed how such surgeries are evaluated. Both conclusions began at the same astonishing fact. Or consider a spring evening in Oxford, 1954, and a junior doctor on a cinder track. For decades, the 4-minute mile had been discussed as a wall in the human constitution. Physiologists had been quoted, in the confident way of the age, on its impossibility. Roger Bannister, who was a physiologist himself, did not believe in the wall, and trained, in his own account, as much in imagination as on the track, rehearsing the race in his mind, until the impossible pace felt familiar. On the 6th of May, he ran the mile in 3 minutes and 59 seconds. And then came the part of the story that belongs to tonight. Within weeks, his rival John Landy, who had been running heartbreaking near misses for years, went under 4 minutes as well. And within a few seasons, runner after runner followed, through a wall that had apparently been made, at least in part, of expectation. The physiology had not changed that May evening. The picture of the possible had. Sports historians rightly add their footnotes: better tracks, better training, the natural march of records. But no one who studies performance now doubts that beliefs about limits function, at the margin, as limits, which is why the psychology of elite sport has become, quite openly, an industry of managed expectation. The golfer Jack Nicklaus, greatest champion of his age, used to say that he never hit a shot, not even in practice, without first seeing it on the private cinema screen behind his eyes. The flight, the landing, the roll, and then, only then, the swing that would produce it. He called it going to the movies, and he considered the film half the shot. When sports scientists later wired athletes and found the motor cortex quietly rehearsing during vivid imagery, the anecdote acquired its mechanism. An illustrator who taught that the imaging faculty cuts the patterns a life will wear would have recognized the method instantly. She had simply prescribed it for rent and marriages rather than 5 irons. And consider, finally, the gentlest study of all, one made not of interventions but of old letters. In the archives of an order of American nuns, researchers found the short autobiographies each sister had written on entering the convent, most of them in their early 20s, decades before. The scientists coded the little essays for emotional tone, the warmth, the joy, the gratitude in the young handwriting, and then did something no one had been able to do before. They compared that tone with how long each sister lived, in a population whose diets, routines, and circumstances had been almost identical for 60 years. The sisters whose youthful pages had glowed with positive feeling lived, on average, years longer than their more somber sisters, and the difference was not small. Correlation, the researchers said carefully, is not cause, and they were right to say it. But somewhere in those quiet archives, the inner weather of a 22-year-old had cast a shadow, or a light, 60 years long. None of these stories proves a law of the universe. Each has its qualifications, its rival explanations, its careful footnotes, and the honest ledger we are about to open applies to them too. But hold them together: the ceremonial surgery that healed, the wall of belief that fell, the champion at his private cinema, the nun's long-lived joy, and you begin to see why the old teacher's room stayed full, and why her little book refuses to die. The claim that mind is everything is false. The claim that mind is nothing has become, by now, equally impossible to defend. The truth, as usual, lives in the disputed middle. And now, as promised, the other ledger: read without flinching. Every philosophy should be weighed at its weakest point, not its strongest. So let us sit calmly and without rancor with the best of the criticisms, because they are serious, and some of them are damning to the strong version of this teaching. The first is the one we have carried all night, the evidence problem. The case for the law of expectancy, as Florence stated it, rests on stories, and stories are the natural habitat of confirmation bias. Her books record the student who affirmed and prospered. They do not record, because no one records, the students who affirmed and did not. This is survivorship bias, the oldest distortion in the self-help library. The shelf of testimonies is written entirely by the winners. A century of her tradition has produced mountains of anecdote, and no controlled demonstration of any effect beyond the psychological mechanisms we have already, and more parsimoniously, described. The second criticism is moral, and it is the gravest. If thought creates circumstance, then circumstance indicts thought, and the logic runs downhill to a cruel conclusion. The poor must have thought poorly, the sick must have feared unwisely, the victim must have somehow invited the crime. Critics call this victim blaming, and the darkest versions of the manifestation movement have earned every word of the charge, telling grieving and struggling people, in effect, that their suffering is their own vibration made visible. Whole books have been written on the damage, among them Barbara Ehrenreich's scalding account of being urged, amid cancer treatment, to regard her tumor as a gift her mindset could master. Any fair reading must note that Florence herself lived before this industry, wrote with gentleness, and spent her days helping the defeated rather than lecturing them. But the seed of the problem is in her premises, and honesty says so. A teaching that makes the mind sovereign over circumstance will always, in careless hands, put circumstance on trial. The third criticism carries a name coined by the psychologist John Wellwood: spiritual bypassing, the use of spiritual ideas to avoid feeling what must be felt. A person schooled to speak only words of prosperity and health can come to treat their own grief, anger, and fear as failures of technique, stuffing them out of sight beneath a mask of affirmations. Modern emotion research is blunt about where that leads. Chronic suppression tends to intensify what it hides, and to corrode well-being. There is a real tension here with everything the clinical world has learned about the value of acknowledging difficult feeling, and readers of Florence must manage that tension themselves, because her books, children of a stiffer age, will not manage it for them. The fourth is historical. The Game of Life is a document of white, comfortable, boom-time Manhattan, published 4 years before the crash. Its cheerful universe of demonstrated rents and perfect apartments was easier to believe on that island, in that decade, than in the breadlines that followed, or in the vast stretches of the world where effort and expectation are crushed by forces no affirmation touches. A philosophy of individual mind, critics note, is conveniently silent about structure, about the systems that distribute opportunity, long before anyone's thinking begins. The silence is not neutral. And the fifth is interpretive, the modern misreading. Much of what circulates today under the banner of manifestation is Florence, with the hard parts removed, the picturing without the ditch digging, the receiving without the giving, the law without the honesty. Manifestation is not magic, affirmation is not wishing, and faith, in her own account, was proved by work. Some of the harshest criticisms of this tradition are, in truth, criticisms of its abridgment. What would her defenders answer? Roughly this: that she never promised sovereignty over circumstance, only responsibility for one's response to it. That between the falsehood that mind controls everything, and the despair that mind controls nothing, lies the modest truth she actually worked. That attitude is one real lever among many, and usually the only one already in a person's hand. That her teaching, honestly practiced, made people kinder, calmer, braver, and more generous. Which is not nothing, whatever the cosmos is doing. You may settle that argument for yourself, some other day, in the daylight. Tonight it is enough to have heard both ledgers read. The fire has burned down to embers now, and the deep of the night is close. But before we follow the little book into the century after its author, there are a few rooms of her teaching we have passed but not yet entered. The rooms where she talked, in her plain way, about money and love and the body and what it means to fail. Let us wander through them slowly, the way one wanders a sleeping house. Money was where most of Florence's students began, because money was where their fear lived. Rent, in the New York of her classes, was the great monthly examination, and much of the Game of Life is, on its surface, a book about rent. Her teaching on prosperity rested on a single reversal. The world says, get, then you will have, then you can give. Florence taught the sequence backwards. Giving opens the way to receiving, she wrote, and the two are, in her image, one current, flowing through a person rather than pooling in them. A closed hand cannot receive, and a life organized entirely around holding on, she observed, tends to strangle its own supply, not because heaven punishes misers, but, we might say today, because fear narrows everything it touches: vision, generosity, risk, warmth, and finally opportunity itself. So she prescribed giving, and not only of money, attention, praise, forgiveness, tithes, time. Her students were startled to arrive with a lack and be sent away with an instruction to give something. But the deeper aim, in her own account, was never the gift. It was the inner statement the gift made. A person who gives, even modestly, even nervously, has just informed their own subconscious that they are someone who has enough to give. The act rewrites the identity, and the identity, as we heard earlier tonight, steers the behavior. Here she has been badly misread, so let it be said plainly in the dark. Prosperity, in this teaching, is not greed. Florence's own definition of abundance was fitted to the divine design, the supply belonging to one's actual life and work, not the hoard of a life copied from magazines. She lived simply herself, by every account, in rented rooms, teaching to the end. The gospel of infinite luxury that later generations built on her foundations would have puzzled the woman who wrote that one's supply comes with one's purpose. And what would our century's ledger say? That the metaphysics, as ever, is unproven, and that the psychology, as ever, is more supportive than a skeptic might guess. A substantial body of research associates generosity with well-being. Spending on others, in studies by Elizabeth Dunn and colleagues, reliably produces more happiness than equivalent spending on oneself, and giving appears to activate ancient reward circuitry. Gratitude research, from Robert Emmons and others, finds that the deliberate counting of blessings, the very practice Florence set her students as homework, measurably lifts mood, improves sleep, and, intriguingly, seems to loosen the grip of financial anxiety by shifting attention from lack to sufficiency. None of this makes giving a slot machine. All of it suggests that the open hand changes the giver, and that Florence's rent-hunted students, sent out to give and to bless and to count what they had, were being treated, a half-century early, with tools a positive psychologist would recognize on sight. There was a story she loved to tell in this room of her teaching, and it can be our lamp as we move to the next. A woman came to her, needing a large sum by a certain date, and was taught, against every instinct, to hold her mind on abundance and act with an open hand while doing everything practical she could. The money arrived, in Florence's telling, at almost the final hour, from a direction no one had foreseen. Perhaps it happened exactly so. Perhaps the telling improved with the years, as tellings do. But notice at least what the story was for. It existed to keep a frightened person functional, generous, and awake to unexpected doors, during the exact weeks when fear wanted her frozen. Whatever else that is, it is not nothing. Beyond the money room lie the others, and Florence walked her students through each. On love and relationships, her teaching was quietly radical for its time. What arrives from others, she taught, tends to mirror what lives in us. The person starving for love, while rehearsing their own unworthiness, is broadcasting the very signal that keeps love at a distance. She warned against clutching here more than anywhere, having watched jealousy and desperate need suffocate the affection they meant to keep. No one, she taught, can truly be lost to you who belongs in your design, and no one can be kept by force who does not. Change yourself, and your relationships change, she said, because a relationship is a conversation, and no conversation survives unchanged when one voice changes. Modern attachment research and decades of couples studies would put it differently, in terms of internal working models and demand-withdrawal cycles and self-fulfilling relational expectations, but the family resemblance is unmistakable. We do, measurably, tend to receive back the emotional weather we persistently transmit, and the anxious grip does, measurably, tend to push away what it holds. On health, we must be both fair and firm. Florence, a child of the mind-cure tradition, believed thought and word played a direct part in illness and healing, and she said so without our era's caution. Tonight's honest translation runs like this: that chronic fear and hostility burden the body is now mainstream science. The physiology of long-running stress, mapped by researchers like Robert Sapolsky, reaches the heart, the immune system, the gut, and sleep itself. That calm, connection, purpose, and positive expectation support recovery within real limits is also well evidenced. But thought does not cure disease. Affirmations do not replace medicine, and the tradition's darkest failures have come precisely where these lines were blurred. Read her health chapters as a document of their era. Keep your physician, and take from them only what stands, that the mind is part of the body's environment, and it is worth keeping that environment kind. And on success and failure, the room her ambitious students most wanted to see, her teaching was almost mischievously calm. There is no competition in the divine design, she insisted. What is yours cannot be taken by another. So envy is not only corrosive but confused, a fear response to a scarcity that does not exist at the level that matters. Failure she treated as a signpost rather than a sentence, often the closing of a wrong door so that a right one could be noticed, and she filled her classes with cases of losses that had turned, in time, into redirections. Every great failure, she liked to show, conceals the success trying to happen. A psychologist today would want to slow her down here, would speak of grief, of real and unrecoverable losses, of the difference between reframing and denial. And yet the same psychologist would recognize the skeleton of her method in modern cognitive reappraisal, one of the best evidenced emotion regulation strategies we have, and in the post-traumatic growth literature, which finds that many people, though not all, and never on command, do eventually weave real meaning from real loss. Florence, who had woven her own second life from the wreck of her first, taught the strong version. The evidence supports the gentle one. Somewhere far off in our imagined night, a church bell counts a small hour, and the sound comes to you softened by snow. Stay warm where you are. We have one practical errand left before the story closes, and it is the gentlest of them all, to ask what a listener in our century, lying comfortably in the dark, might actually take from all this tomorrow. Imagine then, not a seeker in 1925, but a handful of people who might be listening tonight, somewhere in the world, in beds like yours. Imagine a nurse who has come home from a long shift, and who has noticed, lately, the way she talks about her own life. Always exhausted, she hears herself say, never gets a break. If she took one thing from Florence's rooms, it might be simply the noticing, not forced cheer, not denial of a hard job, only the small discipline of letting her words describe the day without decreeing the decade. This week was exhausting, rather than, I am always exhausted. The research on self-talk suggests the grammar matters more than it seems. The door it leaves open matters most of all. Imagine a man in his 50s, made redundant in the spring, who has caught himself rehearsing, each night, a detailed documentary of his own decline. He might borrow the older tool. 10 minutes in the morning, not fantasizing the corner office, but rehearsing the process. The 2 applications sent, the former colleague called, the walk taken, the obstacle named and answered. Mental contrasting, the scientist calls it. Digging ditches, said the illustrator. Either way, the picture pulls the feet. Imagine a young woman, after a hard ending, who has read that she should affirm, into the mirror, that she is confident and whole, and who feels worse every time she says it, exactly as the Ontario study would predict. She might try the older, humbler wording instead, the kind Florence actually wrote. Not a claim her mind will rise up to contradict, but an opening. The right doors are opening for me. I am willing to be surprised. Statements the inner skeptic can live with, repeated at the 2 hinges of the day, on waking and here, at the edge of sleep, when the mind files what it is handed. Imagine someone whose evenings have been spent in the courtroom of an old grievance, prosecuting a case no verdict can close. The forgiveness room is theirs. Not reconciliation, not approval. No phone call required. Only the nightly release of the prisoner who, it turns out, was themselves, perhaps with the old teacher's odd homework of wishing the offender well in words, once, quietly, to see what loosens. And imagine, simply, anyone at all, ending the day the way Florence ended her classes, with a short accounting of what arrived that was good. 3 things, counted on the fingers. The practice her tradition called counting blessings, and the laboratories now call a gratitude intervention, and your grandmother called saying your prayers. It improves measured sleep as it happens. She would not have been surprised. And imagine one more listener, perhaps the nearest of all. Someone lying in the dark right now, who has noticed that the last hour of their day belongs by unexamined habit to the scroll and the churn, to other people's emergencies and their own replayed regrets. Florence's century had no phones, But it had the habit, and she prescribed for it directly. The final thoughts of the day, she taught, should be chosen with more care than any others, because the mind takes its last instructions into the deep. Sleep science, as we heard, has given that old intuition a mechanism, the night shift of consolidation, filing what the day handed it. So the practice is almost embarrassingly simple, and it is the one practice tonight has quietly been performing on you. End the day inside a chosen story rather than a random one, a page of something calm. 3 things counted, 1 gentle sentence about tomorrow. The old teachers called it keeping the watch of the mind at evening. You may simply call it this. Small tools, all of them. None requires a single metaphysical belief. Each is a way of taking, from a strange old book, only what the evidence will carry, which was our bargain all night. The listener may keep the theology or leave it at the door. The practices travel light. And now the fire is truly down to its last few points of gold, and the story asks to be finished. Let us follow the little book out of that lamplit room, and watch what a century did with it. Florence Scovel Shinn died in New York in October 1940, as the lights were going out across Europe. She left no organization, no church, no anointed successor, only the books, and the students, and the habit her readers had of pressing the small volume into other hands. It turned out to be enough. Within a few years of her death, a young lecturer from Barbados, named Neville Goddard, was rising through the same New York metaphysical world, teaching an even more radical doctrine, that imagination is God, and that assuming the feeling of the wish fulfilled is the whole of the law. Neville's polished, hypnotic teaching carried the imaginal core of the tradition to new audiences, and today, revived by the internet, he may be more read than he ever was alive. Alongside him came Joseph Murphy, an Irish-born minister whose book The Power of Your Subconscious Mind, published in 1963, translated the old teachings into the era's psychological vocabulary and sold in the millions. Readers who know both authors hear Florence's plain, practical voice beneath Murphy's case studies on nearly every page. The 1950s brought the teaching to the American mainstream in a business suit. Norman Vincent Peale, pastor of Marble Collegiate Church on Fifth Avenue, a few miles from Florence's old classrooms, praised her books directly and wove positive affirmation into respectable Protestant self-help. The power of positive thinking sat atop the bestseller lists for years, and with it, ideas first refined in those little New Thought parlors entered boardrooms, locker rooms, and at least one future presidential household. Then, in 1984, a former Shinn student in the truest sense, a woman who had found the little book in hard times, carried the tradition to its late-century summit. Louise Hay, whose You Can Heal Your Life sold tens of millions of copies, named Florence among her formative influences, and built from the old affirmation practice a publishing empire, Hay House, that would in turn publish Wayne Dyer, whose gentle PBS philosophy of intention and self-worth carried recognizably Shinn-shaped ideas to audiences of millions more. And in 2006, Rhonda Byrne's The Secret, drawing openly on the whole New Thought lineage, compressed the tradition into the law of attraction and sold it to the entire planet, 30 million copies and counting, trailing behind it both a genuine revival of these old books and the sharpest backlash the tradition has ever faced, for every reason we weighed in the honest ledger. Strip away the packaging of any decade, and the inheritance is easy to trace. The morning affirmation in a busy person's phone, the vision board in the spare room, the athlete's visualization routine, arrived by a more scientific road, but resting on the same faculty. The therapist's gentle question about what story a client keeps telling themselves. The million small daily acts of people tending their expectations like gardens. Somewhere beneath a remarkable amount of the modern culture of self-development, if you dig down through the layers, you strike the same small book, printed at its author's own expense, in the winter of 1925. Did you know that it has never been out of print in 100 years? Fashions in self-help arrive like weather, sweep the shelves, and vanish. The little green book stays. Perhaps because it is short, perhaps because it is kind, or perhaps because it asks the one question that never ages, the question we carried into this night and must now, very softly, carry out of it. We began, hours ago it may seem, with a woman at a desk by lamplight, reading a rejection, and choosing to believe her own book. We have traveled a long way since then, you and I, through the gaslit lecture rooms of old New York and the galleries of a Philadelphia art school, through a golden marriage and its ending, down the strange river of New Thought, past the clockmaker and the teacher of teachers, past William James holding his honest lamp. Through the rooms of the little book itself, the game and the boomerang, the law of expectancy, the wand of the word, the scissors of the imagination, the design and the release and the open hand, and through our own centuries' laboratories, which found no magic anywhere, and yet kept finding, again and again, that the old teacher had her thumb on something real, that expectation steers perception, that words shape their speaker, that rehearsal builds capacity, that letting go is a skill, that forgiveness heals the forgiver, and that a life leans, slowly, in the direction of its persistent inner weather. So was she right? Not in the way she believed, the evidence suggests. The universe, as far as anyone can demonstrate, is not a mirror, and no spoken word commands it. But not simply wrong either, and wrong in a more interesting way than her critics allow. She mistook the mechanism and saw the phenomenon. She called it divine law. We call it attention, prediction, expectation, habit, and the long compounding of small acts. She said the game had rules. On that much, at least, the professor and the prophetess agree. And perhaps the question that matters tonight was never the cosmic one. Perhaps it is the small one she would have asked you herself, in that warm room, with the snow coming down outside the windows. What are you expecting? Quietly, underneath everything. What do you say about your life when no one is listening but you? Those questions need no answer now. They will keep. Let them drift beside you, unresolved, the way the best questions do. The lamps are going out along the avenue now, one by one. The lecture room is empty, the chairs are still, and the little book lies closed on the desk, its work done for another night. Somewhere the presses that have printed it for 100 years are quiet until morning. The city that argued over it, doubted it, loved it, is asleep, and the snow goes on falling past the streetlights, unhurried, certain of its way down. You have listened long and kindly, and there is nothing left to hold. If Florence was right, then your last drifting thoughts are seeds, so let them be gentle ones. And if she was wrong, then you have simply spent a night among interesting ideas, in good company, and you are warm, and the bed is soft, and sleep is coming to meet you anyway, the way it always has, the way the right things do, in its own perfect way, at its own perfect hour. Let go of the day. The game will wait for morning. Sleep into power, and good night.